Okay, great. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. I do see some new faces. Every time I do a class, I grab a couple new people from the ether, which is really wonderful to see. We have slightly too large a group to do introductions and that sort of thing. But maybe over the course of our discussion today, if you do have occasion to participate, you might just say your name before you begin. Maybe just say where you're calling in from. That just makes everybody feel a little bit more human about this endeavor, which is, after all, what we're after. There's a great. I would say there's not an irony to the fact that we're using this wonderful technology to commune today. I was very impressed, as some of you may know from my social media feeds, very impressed by Pope Leo's remarks about technology, and very impressed by the way he articulated what a lot of us have been saying, which is that technology goes back to the Greek techne. I mean, it's a craft, it's a tool, but there's a distinction to be made between how the ethical valuation of a tool in theory, and then how that tool is employed in practice. And what a wonderful job I think he did of pointing out that in practice, technology is embedded in the power structures that develop it, the financial structures that develop it. I think we're living at a remarkable time. Things change so quickly, and I'm not just talking about technology, I'm talking about sort of public opinion. A year ago, it felt like the wave of artificial intelligence was going to carry us like little children in the surf and move us in a direction even if we didn't want to go there. And there has been this tremendous groundswell of people sort of recognizing something I've often said, right? Which is that let's call it an advance, every advance in technology requires at least as much of an advance in our ethical thinking and our self-consciousness, our awareness. When we split the atom, there we have this great technology in our hands, and it requires us to say, what are we going to do with it? So, it's very easy to be doom and gloom about things. We certainly have a lot of reasons for that in our world today. But I want to start on this positive note of saying how moved I've been as just one person observing this groundswell of humanity. And people really saying, it turns out if we just follow the market forces that drive technology, we are all going to lose our souls. And so here we are, thinking about these really big issues, and I just think that's fantastic. So I want to start on that positive note. I'd like to discuss a few different things today. I've titled this gathering "Living the Mystery." I was thinking a lot about the great Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca, who once remarked, "Only mystery makes us live," which I think is a beautiful remark. I had the privilege of spending some time in Granada with Lorca's niece, Laura Garcia Lorca. And I remember standing there in Lorca's bedroom and feeling his presence. And I remember it was almost as though I could hear those words, "Only mystery makes us live." So what I'd like to do today, just to give us a little bit of structure, is I would like to talk about something that maybe isn't the first thing we think of when we think of the mystery of being human. And that's our needs. What we need as individual human beings, because I think the ways in which technology can start using us instead of us using technology is when it hijacks those needs and those hungers, right? It's the same way an addiction works. It's hijacking some very natural mechanisms that are already there in the brain. They're reward centers. So I want to talk about that. And being that, my whole vision for this academy that I've been running is to think about what I call the whole human being. So every time we can't talk about poetry without talking about spirituality, without talking about philosophy, without talking about all these osophies and isms that really are just ways of breaking up the wholeness of our mind. So to do that, I want to say to everybody that I'm going to begin by using some imagery and some techniques from the Christian tradition, but this is for everybody. So what I'm certainly not saying is that this is the only way to approach these truths, but as I always tell my poetry students, the way to the universal is through the particular, right? You want to write about fathers, you write about your father. You want to write about grief, as the great Archibald MacLeish told us, write about an empty doorway and a maple leaf. It's a beautiful image. So I'm going to use some of these teachings to get across what I think really is universal in any spiritual way of approaching the world. So don't feel excluded at all if that imagery is something not only that you don't believe in, but that maybe brings up some wounds and some scars for you. I want to honor that. So I'm not preaching to you today. But I want to use some language to try to get us into this question of what we need as human beings. Okay, so let's begin here. There's a fantastic figure I've taught about him before. His name was Thomas Keating, Keating, who was really a wonderful teacher. He was a Trappist monk, and Thomas Merton was another Trappist monk, and some of you may know Thomas Merton and his writings. Thomas Merton did a lot in the mid to late 20th century to introduce or reintroduce the themes of contemplation, reflection, silence, personal soul searching that we saw again in Pope Leo's encyclical. He was talking about some of these issues. So the Trappists are, I'm an associate of a Benedictine order. It's a sort of, my relationship to it is only as an associate, but the Trappists are generally known as very, a little bit forbidding. They're very serious. And what's funny is that some of the most famous Trappists have been these most ebullient human people. And honestly, I think that's what spirituality is all about. You kind of go through what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, and there's always this joy and praise there as well. So Thomas Keating was the abbot at a monastery called St. Joseph's up in Massachusetts. I had the privilege of going there about a year or two ago. It's a beautiful place. And I want you to imagine this was in the late 60s, early 1970s. And I'll tell you a little story that he was fond of telling. He was the abbot there, and late 60s and early 1970s were not a time when Christianity was very popular. And this is, of course, a time before GPS, MapQuest, that kind of thing. And he said, invariably, we'd get a knock on the door, and I'd see that it was young people. And I would say, oh, I'm so excited. People are interested. And I'd open the door, and he said, not 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, they'd say, hi, yes, we're a little lost. Can you tell me how to get to the Buddhist monastery nearby? And of course, he was a very kind man, and he'd send them on their way. But that led to this really interesting thing in his mind. He got to thinking, what are some other traditions offering? Let me phrase it this way, that people don't think Christianity is offering. I grew up, I will tell you a personal anecdote. I grew up in a Roman Catholic household. When I speak publicly and elsewhere in praise of the Pope, I was not someone who grew up with a perfectly happy, healthy, loving relationship to the church. I still have issues with it. But in Thomas Keating's mind, he said there's something that people, and I think the church did go in the direction of repression, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The connection I'm trying to make is, why are we getting in trouble with technology? Is because we're not in touch with ourselves. And I think a lot of our institutions are repressing parts of ourselves. So Thomas Keating looked at it and he said, what is it about Christianity and maybe other traditions that's turning people off? And he said, because I feel like I know something. And that is, if you go back far enough before some of the power structures of the church twisted the message of the Gospels, there was something there, and here's the point I want to make today, that is really about human psychology. I didn't know this myself, even as a student of the scriptures for many years. But if you read the Gospels closely, this figure, and today we're not, again, I'm not preaching to you, so we'll just speak about the figure of Jesus as a teacher, which people in all traditions are welcome to think of him as. I believe he was doing psychology. And I want to talk about how that happened. So Thomas Keating has passed on, but I learned this from his teachings. So these are his teachings that I'm going to start with. These are not mine, but I love them. He said, let's look at an interesting passage. In the Gospels, after Jesus receives baptism, which we have to remember is actually a beginning in humility. Unlike many of our leaders today, he doesn't come and say, I am the great king, all bow down before me. He humbles himself by going to John, and John even says, why am I'm supposed to baptize you? Yes, that's the way it's supposed to be. He humbles himself, he gets baptized. Remember that baptism is really a reenactment of an ancient thing that's older than any faith. Rinsing ourselves, washing ourselves, preparing for something new. But after that, what does Jesus do? He goes out into the wilderness. He goes to be alone. So he does not immediately put on the cloak of greatness and say, now I will go into the cities and I will preach my greatness. He says, I'm going to need a minute. And he goes out into the wilderness. And who does he meet in the wilderness, of course? Is that great figure that, depending on how Manichaean you are in life, whether you believe in a Satan or the dark forces, or let's speak about them psychologically, the shadow side of ourselves. Why are we so tempted to doom scroll on our phones, to go into addictions, it's hard to be by ourselves. First of all, we're not really designed for it as social human beings. But there's so much that's waiting to catch up with us. I mean, I speak with no self-righteousness. I can't tell you how many days I've had where I feel I'll do anything but sit with myself. And Christ goes into the wilderness and he sits with himself, and he meets the dark side. But what's interesting is I never knew until Thomas Keating pointed this out. What he's really meeting is an encounter with what he needs. Not as a divine being, but as a human being. So let's go into what those are. So the shadow side says to him, he tempts him, he gives him 3 temptations. And it doesn't matter which order they're in. First temptation we'll talk about is, what does he say to Jesus? He says, you know what? You're supposed to be God. Take these stones and turn them into bread. You must be hungry. You're here in the wilderness. And Jesus, who was very well read, or if not literate, he was very well learned, he quotes from the Old Testament, and he says, look, man does not live by bread alone. Now, I grew up thinking, okay, that's just a general Sunday school sentiment that we all need something more in life. But Thomas Keating said this beautiful thing. He said, I want you to think about it psychologically. As a human being, we have 3 essential needs. And that first need that we have from the moment we're little infants is for security and safety. Security and safety. What is the biggest trauma in a young child's life is not to feel that safety. And so what the shadow side is saying to Jesus as a human is, aren't you afraid you don't have enough to eat? Aren't you afraid? Think of what Jesus says again and again in the Gospels, be not afraid. He's not saying there's nothing to be afraid about. He's saying fear is going to rot your life. So to the shadow side, he's saying, you know what? And this is the key. He is not repressing or rejecting or denying his need for safety. Here's the beginning of the divine psychology. He's saying, yes, I need safety. But then he's doing a second thing. But I'm going to hand that to God. I'm going to believe that there is a way for me to achieve that, so that that drive, that infantile drive for safety, is not unconsciously driving my life at every moment.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I mean, you can be in a relationship with somebody and feel unsafe in a moment. And I'm not talking about things like domestic abuse or injustice. You can have some ghost in you that comes up, and if you're not conscious of it, there it goes, and we take it out. We look at people, I mean, how beautiful it was for Pope Leo to talk about the risk of Chat GPT and things like that, providing for people things that they need elsewhere. And that's the leap I'm trying to make, that he didn't quite get into, because there's only so much he could say as one person. But I think we're at risk of saying, I am going to not even be conscious of my needs, and then the technology will take over a blanket and false fulfillment of them. So the first thing we need to do is almost wake up in the morning and say, yes, I feel afraid and I need safety. There is power in just feeling that and embracing that, rather than letting that unconscious fear drive your life. Now, depending on your spiritual beliefs, you can do as Jesus did and say, I hand it to God. You can, or you can go in another route, but it's the beginning of it, of being conscious of it. Okay, so now, the dark side's not done with Jesus. And the dark side says to him, you know what? How about this? I'm going to take you up to this high place. Cast yourself down. Throw yourself off this high place. Because if you really are the Son of God, certainly the angels will come and protect you and lift you up. And in a brilliant move, Thomas Keating said, I want to relate that to another human need, which is the need for esteem, respect. Because if you jumped off a tower and the angels came and lifted you up, wouldn't that be impressive? I mean, that would be wonderful. And it would be wonderful to others, or at least it would be wonderful to the others in ourselves. We're always trying to impress ghosts in us, aren't we, anyway? You know, and we realize that at some point we don't need to impress those ghosts. And so Jesus again rejects that. But the point of the gospel is that it's in the scripture that that temptation came to him. The wrong way, I believe, of looking at these teachings is deny that you need esteem. See, that's the repressive version of it. The right way is, why the heck is it in the scripture if not to say, admit that you want esteem. Admit that you want respect. Now, those are two different things. We all should have respect. And then what am I saying here? Taking it to this next step, be conscious of it so that it does not lead your life unconsciously. That's where the wounds come in, and that's where we hurt other people. Stumbling around, you know, I mean, I you know, it would be ridiculous if I didn't get political. I mean, there's a man in the White House who's just destroying the world. And this is somebody who pathetically has never, and here I am judging, but I'm going to do it, pathetically has never confronted these. You know, instead of saying, yes, I need everyone, I need esteem, it leads him like a bull by the nose. Okay? And people in power compel others to live in their psychic experience. That's a great tragedy. But can we humble ourselves for a moment and say, we're all in our own little White House in our lives. We all have power. We have power over our children. We have power on some degree over, and we have influence over maybe our students, our friends. And are we being tyrants in our own lives? Are we being tyrants because we're not owning up to what we need and those unconscious drives are pulling us? I know I've made those errors. So the third thing then that the dark side says to Jesus is, all right, I'm going to give you the biggest temptation of all. Power. Look at all these kingdoms of the earth. Now we can sit here and pontificate and say, of course, that is very hard to say no to. We've all had a tough Wednesday. The bills are adding up. And here you are. You can have the whole world. Everything will bow down before you. Now, if you believe in the divinity of Christ, it's kind of unbelievably miraculous that he said, that's not the way I'm going to come to the world. But if you just want to think of him as a human teacher, go to Keating's remark. This is, again, an admission of our need for power. Now, power is one thing. Control. We all need a certain matrix of control in our lives. I mean, I think we would fall apart if we didn't have any, you know. But I often say to my students, one of the great questions that pops up every time you're trying to write something is one of the great questions that also happens in life. When do I exercise control and when do I let it be? That's a very difficult question. But again, if we go back to this passage in the scriptures, let us not take the misstep that I think I heard in it for many years, which is, therefore the scripture there is telling us you should not want power and control. Do you see how immediately, I don't know what you felt when I said that, I felt physically separated from a part of myself, fractured. And as I once said to my students, it took me a long time to learn, there's no feeling you need to reject. There's no feeling you need to feel ashamed of. Feelings are different from actions. So in a way, if you think of the scripture holistically, psychologically, and think of that voice of Satan as the dark side, which is in all of us, the scripture is saying, admit that that is there. You wake up and you say, when someone cuts you off on the highway, do you feel disrespected? Do you feel you don't have power? Do you feel unsafe? When I was a young man, I had a pretty bad temper at times. And I would let those things move through me and cause my actions, instead of pausing to say, I feel disrespected and I feel I have no power right now. Because the mind connects things, right? We're having a bad day. Someone cuts us off on the highway. Maybe something's going on in my personal life. I don't feel I have power, and it all spirals. So instead I say to myself, okay, do I need that validation from that stranger driving that car? How ridiculous is that? And yet, how human. Shakespeare would sit here and say, he would kind of intuitively know all this. You know, it's an artist's job to kind of portray characters as we really are. So I encourage us to start with those questions of needs, and to think about then the place of technology in our lives. What need? I often said, I too have found myself in a doom scroll on the phone. Forgive me, my contacts are drying out here. I gotta keep playing. I found myself in a doom scroll on the phone at times. And it's almost like I say, I'm diving down into what am I looking for? What's the end of this? And that becomes a question of false fulfillment as well. But let's come back to that question of our need. If you can connect with your needs, what you're really doing is you're integrating your different aspects of yourself. And the biggest thing I always say to people is that we are fractured. I almost feel like we're fractured by necessity. The poet Jane Hirschfield has a line something like, neither something entirely whole nor something entirely broken can speak. And Louise Glick, the great poet, Nobel laureate, says, I speak because I am shattered. So there's almost a way in which brokenness is inherent in the condition of being human. But it's important to reflect on the ways in which certain institutions of power have a vested interest in keeping us broken. The quiet little work we're doing here is just as, if not more, revolutionary than holding up signs outside, because we're doing the inner work of saying, if I become more whole as a person, then you can't sell me, you being anybody, a false fulfillment, right? If I connect to my feeling of needing esteem and I sit with it, and for each one of us in this room, it's going to do something different for our lives. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with wanting esteem and wanting, I live my life trying to spread the message I have. If that means I have to appear on this or that show or do this or that, you just catch yourself and say, am I doing what Carl Jung said? Carl Jung once said, the art harnesses the ego. I love that. So maybe the ego can lead you in a direction that is noble. But the point is just to be conscious of it. So everybody in a different way is going to sit there and think, if I go into myself and I reflect on where my need for esteem really should be guiding me, where my need for safety really should be guiding me, where my need for control should be guiding me, I'm going to make interesting decisions. They're going to be very human. But I'm not going to wake up and say, uh-oh, I spent $5,000 on that new suit. It actually didn't make me feel good. I was acting purely unconsciously, right? And let me tell you, well, I don't think I've done that, but I've done at least as foolish things. So I think that's really important. Any thoughts or questions about that before I say, yeah, Lauren?
Yeah, I wanna talk about the use of the word control.
Yeah.
And I love thinking about the term agency instead, because I do often we want control, right? That then it starts to feel like a need, and then we start kind of that talons in different areas of our lives, people trying to control one another. But that example of like being in the traffic jam and there's some person being absurd on the road, what we don't have is control of the situation, but what we have is agency to decide how we want to respond to the said situation. And I feel like this, like, kind of, to me, so agency being like, I have the power to choose my next step. I have the power to choose what comes out of my mouth. I have the power to walk away. It takes ownership away from pointing the finger elsewhere and doing the U-turn and being like, actually, the control that I have is my agency. And every single one of us has that. And then it takes us out of victim mentality. So that idea of like, I can walk through the world and say, everyone's trying to screw me, even the driver, sure, that's the outward finger. I can say, I'm so broken, I have all this trauma. That is, again, outward finger. Or I can say, I'm actually not broken. Nobody's broken, because then that implies like we must be fixed. And fixing is not a goal. That's what we do to a machine that breaks, right? But what we are is like a work in progress constantly. And I love this idea of like, I can keep sharpening my capacity to recognize the agency that I have when I wake up in the morning, the way I talk to my daughter, the way I respond to the person on the road who's flicking me off,
Yes.
I just, because that feeling control actually makes me feel in my body this, like, it feels restrictive. And so I do unfortunately feel like religion, and I also grew up in the Catholic Church very early on. There are beautiful examples of religion that are very freeing, but I feel that a lot of religion ends up being this, especially for women, this attempt to control. Nobody can actually control you, but there are these systems in place, like technology, that are like hijacking the system.
Yeah. I think it's beautifully said, Lauren, and thank you for that contribution. One thing you touched on is how interesting it is and how powerful language is. And so in your own privacy of your spiritual practice, you get to this place, say, this word challenges me, this word doesn't make me feel good. What do I choose to call something, that need that comes up? So you've touched on something very beautiful, Lauren, which is, for someone in their spiritual journey, they might say, I feel this need. What am I going to name it? And that's not going to encapsulate it fully, but naming it is such a powerful thing. The other thing you touched on is, I think, yes, really what I've been circling around, which is that we can sit here and say no one can control us, but we certainly are. We're steered in many different ways. And the institution of the church, certainly for one, and I can only speak to that tradition, and there are other examples in other faiths, has perfectly been guilty of repressing huge parts of ourselves. And, I think it was the poet Robert Bly, when he spoke about the unconscious. He would speak in these categorical terms. Sometimes I agreed, sometimes I wouldn't, but he said, at least the Neoplatonic version of Christianity made us afraid of a part of ourselves. And there is Jesus in the Gospels saying, don't be afraid. There is that moment of the temptation in the wilderness that is saying, admit that you have these needs. And so that all circles back to the idea that the institution is trying to repress. You talk about inherent misogyny, attitudes toward repressing the unknown, the complex, right? And there you go back, and in my opinion, and in the opinion of someone like Keating, and Thomas Merton feels this way, I know, you go back and you look at the teachings and you say, oh my goodness. I mean, when this hit me, it changed my life. I was sitting in a monastery. I was broken. I want to say it that way. And this hit me. Oh my goodness. This particular teacher, who is Jesus, is telling me that my life is not a crime. He's not repressing. He's saying, yes, own it, look at it, see it, admit it, be conscious of it. That's what it is to speak about moving into the light, moving from the darkness. It's not this repressive, only be sunflowers and rainbows. It's be aware of that shadow side that is with you in the desert. And you become the one who, in being conscious of it, steers it. As I wrote in a novel one time, when you deny your shadow, it becomes your tyrant. Now that's true of the individual life, and it's true of the collective. We as a collective in the last 10 years or so, you could argue almost any moment in American history, have denied our shadow side with a blanket nostalgia, make America great again, as though in the 1940s after the war, you didn't walk into a pharmacy and were sequestered because of your race. All this blanket nostalgia that is denying the shadow side in us. And what do you do when you deny your shadow? You project it into others. And what does projecting the shadow into others look like? Hate, bigotry, xenophobia, etc. It's all psychological. And you can speak to these people. You can look them in the eyes. They're fellow human beings. They're concerned about gas prices. They're living, it's othering them doesn't help. When I say them, I mean supporters of not necessarily a particular politician, but of those hate-based views. And it all comes back to that, denying the shadow. And the medicine above the door of the monastery I often visit says in Latin, the cross is the medicine of the world. And you can have all different medicines. But if you think of the cross as self-awareness, what does Jesus say on the cross? Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. My belief is that Jesus, there's a term in ancient Greek, it's called the logos. And the term logos goes back at least to pre-Socratic Greek philosophy. Heraclitus, the great Heraclitus, who said wonderful poetic things like the way up and the way down are the same. It's a beautiful psychological point. Who also said you can never step into the same river twice. He said a remark that T.S. Eliot used as an epigraph to the Four Quartets, a great spiritual poem of the 20th century as the bombs were falling on London. And I'll say a translation of the quote from the Greek, but I'm going to leave the word logos in Greek because it's untranslatable. Heraclitus said, the logos is common to all, but each person lives as though he had his own law. Okay, so that's complicated. Logos means something in pre-Socratic philosophy like the order of the world, right? But you can see it develops. So by the time the Gospel of John is written in Greek, how do we translate the beginning of the Gospel of John? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Do you know what Greek word they're using for word? Logos. And so Christ is referred to as the Logos. And in my way of seeing it, what does that mean? That means I think there's something into the theological idea that I'll just put out here, that whatever we mean by God is something like an unconscious force that created the world. And that Christ is the attempt to raise even that to consciousness. You know what's interesting? I just thought about my own son. Anyone who's a parent knows this feeling. I've lived a lot of my life, some things unconscious. Having a child made me wake up a little bit to the things that I'm doing. And I think Christ is serving as that. And so when he says, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do, in a way, this might sound heretical, he's even saying to God, you don't know entirely what you do. I had to become human to do this divine thing of knowing myself. In knowing myself, I have raised you, God, to a higher level of consciousness. It may be heretical to some ways of thinking, but that's something like what I believe. And therefore, I consider the work of individual becoming, even if you're doing it alone in a cell in a monastery, the divine work. So we talk about agency, which is a great word Lauren brought up. We talk about action. My own life varies between trying to take a lot of action, moving the political needle, etc. And there are times when, and I think Pope Leo touched on this, rest, contemplation, reflection. Even some people they don't need the teleological justification. They say, I'm just going to rest. That's fine. That's great. I'm tortured, so I don't get there. But I will say that there is a part of me that thinks in those moments, you could say, I'm becoming as the oak tree becomes. I don't need a witness. And in that act of becoming, perhaps I am participating in a certain teleology of the universe. I propose that idea to you. It's not something, of course, you need to be on board with. But all of these go toward what I'm trying to do here is unpack the apparatus behind the sound bites that we saw from Leo's encyclical, which is contemplate, be in silence. Because I think the young people nowadays especially are raised constantly feeling like if they're not doing something immediately that has actionable results, they don't exist. I mean, my generation grew up, that you found me through social media. I use social media. I'm passionate about trying to use it for good. But I don't think it's a tool I use, right? Coming back to that idea. Whereas I think the young generation is very much tempted to feel like it's me. It's an extension of me. And you're starting to see very young people push back against that because they know deep down that it's not. I love talking about this with you all. Did I see a hand? Questions? Thoughts? Oh, Kim.
I had
okay. Kim and then William. Sorry, I didn't see Kim's hand up.
It was up and then I put it down. It's fine. I'm thinking about my fourth grade students and how before I teach them, reading and writing and social studies, I tell my parents this at the beginning of the year. I'm like, trying to teach your kids how to be good humans and be in the world in a way that they are, responsible and good. And then like from that, everything else can build on that. But I talk with them a lot about being intentional, and I try to explain it to them that like you do things on purpose, and like if you're walking in the hall, like you're doing it on purpose. Like, of course you're doing it on purpose. That sounds silly, but you're thinking about how you're doing it. And if something happens with a classmate or whatever, instead of just reacting, you're thinking about what you do before you respond. And of course, we're not perfect, but trying to get people to think about it. So even things like social media, like then you're using it intentionally, like or AI, like you're using it for some things in ways that are good, but then you're also like, these areas I should not use it for, or
right.
I shouldn't let it take over like what I have to say as a person.
Yes, I think that's very right, Kim, and thank you for sharing that. And I will add the point that while we strive for intentionality and consciousness, T.S. Eliot once said, a bad poet is conscious where he should be unconscious, in addition to being unconscious where he should be conscious. And so we want to live like that, but we also want to live in the flow of being. So you're absolutely right, Kim. And I would add to it that I think what happens is when we come to know ourselves a little bit better, what happens is we begin to trust ourselves and fear ourselves less. And if you can trust yourself and fear yourself less, then you can have those immersive moments, what psychologists call immersive moments, whether it's lovemaking, whether it's writing a poem, whether it's dancing in the rain, whatever it is, where you say, I don't have to be in the conscious mind right now, but I'm moving with my whole self. I firmly believe that except in the most pathological situations, which can happen, you know, the old scholastic Christian theologians used to say, they trying to justify why is there evil in the world? If God is all good and God created the world, how could there be evil? So the way they got around that is they said, well, evil is not a property in the world, it's a privation. It's an absence of good. Where good has retreated, that is evil. Okay. Whereas a more Manichaean approach would be no, evil is like a real kind of thing. I would say where we're most separated from our wholeness is where evil comes in. That's similar to that idea. So again, except in the most pathological situations, people say human nature. You look at humans, the oldest debate in the world, are we good by nature? How can we be good by nature? Look at all the things we do. Well, we got to unpack that philosophically and say, what do we mean by nature? Maybe by nature, we mean when we are at our most synthesized whole and communing with parts of ourselves. So again, we do something, we act out of unconsciousness. It's because we know not what we do. It's because we know not what we are. Whereas in those moments where we can say, I'm admitting to a need I have, I'm admitting to a hunger I have, and it doesn't always have to be like a chess game and a fully conscious approach, but when you all know the moments I'm talking about, when you feel you're most unwounded, when you feel you're most connected to all those parts of yourselves, I think that the actions and words that blossom from those, even if they're challenging to others, even if they're not puppy dogs and ice cream, they're participating in a positive motion of the universe, right? As opposed to something that is just an act of evil. So thank you for opening that conversation, Kim. That was very helpful. And William, you had a thought for us?
Yes, I wanted to uplift your uplifting about brokenness and about being fractured, and just kind of knead the idea around in my hands that that brokenness can be a spark that ignites this becoming that you talk about. And I'm reminded of Jewish Kabbalistic theology, which believes that God broke and shattered, and pieces of God and pieces of light went all over the planet, and each of us is entrusted with one, and they're all kind of trying to come back together and become, almost in the same way that Plato talks about the brokenness of the soul in Symposium. And maybe that's where the Kabbalistic theology got this from. But to relate this to Pope Leo's encyclical, he really lifts up what's called process theology, which I think is kind of new. This author named Catherine Keller wrote an incredible book called On the Mystery, and it's the idea of our souls becoming through being with our needs, but the idea that God within us is also broken and
Yeah.
is also becoming, and
Yeah.
this process that Pope Leo talks about, of God moving through history,
Yes.
is the brokenness of God trying to, well, it's a lot of things, but one aspect is it's the brokenness of God trying to become, and we're all a part of that becoming.
Yes.
That's enough. That's
So,
enough.
no. I hear you, William, and I think these are very important points. So let's slow down on them. I want to pluck so many interesting things like what Lauren was saying, what William is saying. It's interesting because when we use a word, usually that word has a value judgment inherent in it. I think, Lauren, you were touching on that in the word control, whether it's a value judgment that is societally formed or a value judgment that is more privately formed, even though Wittgenstein says there's no private language, the community that forms a value judgment can be small or large. So we're talking about brokenness. Now, brokenness obviously has a negative connotation. I broke the vase. I broke, as you say, a machine. But I do want to touch on, something William is bringing up here. And I wrote some of these thoughts down the other day, so I'm just going to share with you how I phrased this. I do think we move historically. I'm a little bit of a Hegelian in that sense. I think there's a motion in history of ideas. I think we never really know. We always think we're at the end of history. When you're a kid in school and you're looking at the history books, it's almost like this implication that it all happened so we can get here, And so you think about relationships to the unconscious mind. We didn't even call it the unconscious too much, although Nietzsche and others were talking about it. The Greeks kind of were talking about it. But until Freud, we didn't really have a popular language for that. And if you think about, the way in which, for example, even humanity approached reason, the Middle Ages were struggling for that kind of rationality of scholasticism. You get to the Enlightenment, and by the time you get to the Enlightenment, it's like unconscious bad. Reason will lead us to the light. That is our God. This kind of like almost Voltaire-esque, the French encyclopedists, the way of looking at the world. Until I think we're in a moment in history right now where we're realizing, reason's very good, but reason alone will not save us. So we're having this kind of Hegel thought of the pendulum swinging. There's an idea in history. That's the thesis. Then it swings to the opposite idea, the antithesis. Then it comes to a synthesis of those ideas. But then that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and we go back and forth. And I want to propose the idea that everybody we know has a therapist, and that's a darn good thing, right? I've got one. I feel like I got a whole team. and because it helps us be more self-aware. I think it's an ethical obligation to become more self-aware, okay, for obvious reasons. But I think what happened is in the post-Freudian age, we became a little addicted to the notion that everything has a psychological explanation. So let me just read to you a little bit what I wrote and posted the other day. I say one of the mistakes of our post-Freudian age is to believe everything has a psychological explanation. That every drive, where this came from? I was watching a documentary about these men climbing these mountains. And the great English mountaineer, George Mallory, when he was asked, why the heck do you want to climb Mount Everest? He said, because it's there. So I started thinking these drives, why do I climb mountains? Why do I write poems? Why do I do this? The psychological way of looking at it is to reduce it to a wound. Now, so what I say here is every drive, why climb mountains, why write poems, why help others, can be reduced to a personal wound. That's the proposition of the kind of post-Freudian way of thinking. Here's what I say. Those explanations can be very good and very healing, but they're not, I believe, the whole picture. I believe, this is what I believe, there's a divine cause in your life. God, and this touches on what William was getting at, God is what's acting through you. And if that word doesn't fit well with you, say something like the divinity or a higher purpose is what's acting through you. He's writing, he's painting. I say he, that we don't have a word for it. I think God is beyond gender. Loving, building, sitting still, listening. when I see my son playing, I think how absurd from a biological evolutionary point of view would it be for a species called Homo sapiens to create this little thing, that it would be very bad at surviving, that if we were out in the savannas together, and he would be making a lot of noise that would draw the predators toward him. His very existence requires a whole team, to raise. Why, if not for the fact that God is just playing with different ways of being? It's a beautiful idea. And so I say, paradoxically, though, it's not God taking over your agency. That's free will. So if we can hold that paradox, and I mentioned in the beginning, in the description of this course, being human is doing what the great poet John Keats said. He called it negative capability, being able to hold two contrasting ideas in your mind, right? So it's God moving through us, and yet it's us. It's you. It's you doing the living. And I believe, as I phrased it here, you astonish God by becoming more of you, more God than God knew. That's the moment on the cross, forgive them, they know not what they do. In our becoming and rising to consciousness and becoming more of ourselves, we wake God to possibilities he did not even know. And again, forgive the pronoun. And here's where I get to a point that touches on what William was getting at. I believe, as I sit here today, God's wound is the world, the sadness and the joy of existence. But it's not for God a trauma. There's the distinction, getting to what Lauren was talking very beautifully about, implying the value judgments on words. So we call it a wound, but is a wound always a trauma? So I propose that for God, there's a pain that creates, that keeps waking, right? We're a part of that. When we pick up our true work, and the true work is always done out of love, our only task is to follow it. It's asking to be lived, not always understood. Its very nature is, and William said this word too, becoming. And then I close this thought with, that part does not need to be healed. And I think it was very helpful to bring those thoughts up, William, and to tie it back to Lauren's very, very smart, sense of how we're implying how we're valuing things within the words. But I wanted to mention that as well. So when we talk about our brokenness, we must make a spiritual, theological, philosophical, psychological distinction between existential brokenness from some imagined Platonic wholeness, which I believe is good and necessary. And in that sense, Lauren, yes, that part's not broken in the value judgment sense. But then there's the other part that is fractured by trauma. Individual trauma, personal trauma, societal trauma, repression, misogyny, racism, all of that sort of stuff. And in those ways, the structures of our society have an interest in keeping us broken in that way. So we can heal ourselves to the point, but then we are no more whole than the oak tree is whole. No more whole than winter is whole. We're a part of something. So I think it's very, very interesting that these ideas are coming up, and it's really important to think about them. I want to show you so quickly. We're kind of talking about questions. I just want to show you a couple poems that I think touch on some of this stuff, just because I think poetry is. It's almost like there are no new ideas under the sun, but there are new ways to say them, and the saying them is the new idea. And so if I can just share, I'm going to try to do this miraculous thing here. This is a great poem that many of you, I'm sure, know by Rilke, of course, originally written in German. The original German of Rilke uses more formal and rhyme sort of ideas than are obvious in most of the translations. But I do believe this is a very beautiful living translation by Joanna Macy. I think she had a co-translator whose name I'm forgetting. Anyway, I want to read this little poem because it ends on this beautiful question. And Rilke lets this question ring out. And one of the things I would encourage you to do, we've talked about a lot of ideas today, is try to experience. Rilke says, live the question. Try to experience these ideas and live them. And so Rilke writes, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I've been circling around God, around the primordial around the primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? That's a beautiful poem. And I think here is where Rilke, as a great poet, allows that question to linger. I don't think we have symbolism in poetry in the sense that a symbol reduces something irreducible, but I think these images resonate. A falcon. What is a falcon if not something that has great hunger? That is designed, hunger formed its beak, hunger formed its talons, hunger formed its eyes. Or a storm. A storm can be a wonderful nourishing thing for an ecosystem, but it can be very destructive. It can be that dark side. Or do I put them all together and become a great song? So I don't think Rilke was thinking of this consciously, but in a way, this poem really connects to a lot of the themes we've been talking about today. He embraces the questions, the needs, and the various parts of himself, and he lets them live. And that's one of the things, we don't need to get anywhere today or at any time. Like when we're done with this call, you might try to take a walk or sit there and say, there's an unresolved need in me. I can't do anything about it right now. There's a hunger in me for something. What if what I'm meant to do is sit with it? Jesus didn't spend a half hour in the wilderness. And Rilke didn't resolve this poem on an answer. So what if we are meant to sit with those questions? And what if that circles back to what Leo and others are talking about, which is that what does AI try to do? It tries to give us the answer for everything. Now, I'm not a Luddite in the sense that I don't want the answers. When my son asked me, what's the temperature on Neptune, I can Google it and this magical device can tell me, and I can tell him, right? Most of us know from our childhood, we would have had to go to a dusty card catalog to find that fact. That's great. That's great. But I think what Leo and others are talking about is if that replaces the ability to sit with big questions. I wrote a poem that accidentally became well-known, and when things become well-known, they get misunderstood, and that's fine. We don't control our art after it's out there. I wrote a poem that began with, I drafted it on the back of a student's paper. A student some years ago wrote a paper clearly with AI, so I wrote a little poem called For a Student Who Used AI to Write a Paper. If you've read that poem, I hope you notice that it starts in compassion, right? I know your life is hard now. I know your days are precious on this earth, but what are you trying to be free of? The living, the miraculous task of it. Love is for the ones who love the work. And that last line can be misunderstood. I think most people do understand it. I'm not saying love is exclusively and for only those who are going to turn in their assignments on time. What I'm talking about is, of course, when we get used to taking shortcuts somewhere, we get addicted to taking them everywhere. I believe that's what Leo is talking about as well. My point is there anything inherently wrong with, first of all, I think, yes, there's always something inherently wrong with using like Gen AI. I would never touch it. But like, no, there's nothing wrong with quickly looking up I mean, these are great things. But what if we don't analyze the way we use these technologies, and sooner or later, the greatest question of all comes to us, love. Someone is looking at us in their eyes, asking us the biggest question, which is, can you sit with this mystery? And the greatest tragedy would be if we've forgotten how to do that, because we want to, instead of looking at them, go to our phone and tweet about it. Or instead of looking at them, we want an answer, or we want to talk to a machine. That is what Leo is talking about. I also made a tweet that said a lot of people will try to put out the dog whistle of saying he's trying to regulate AI, even if they're trying to praise what he's doing. Because anytime you talk about regulation, that's a dog whistle for far-right economic ways of looking at the world. He's going to regulate your business. He's not talking about AI. He's talking about humanity. He's talking about dignity. He's talking about the work. And I think that's where the turn is happening, that we got addicted to like efficiency and those sorts of things. And I don't know how young the youngest person is in this group, but I think if there were like a 14-year-old kid, they'd probably be saying something like, yeah, I know, like I'm sick of that stuff, you know, because you can't talk about repression, as Lauren brought up. Was that old movie Jurassic Park said, life will find a way, you know? I think the human soul, we're starting to see that now, wanting it to. So that's what we mean by work. You know, that's what I mean by work. I want to show you another poem here that to make the point that the questions do not always have to be comfortable questions. I think I did this wrong. Okay, so this is a poem by Yeats. It's one of my favorite poems. And he leaves us on this very, very difficult question. It's called The Cold Heaven. It's a visionary moment that he has. Suddenly I saw the cold and rook-delighting heaven that seemed as though ice burned and was but the more ice. And thereupon imagination and heart were driven so wild that every casual thought of that and this vanished and left but memories that should be out of season with the hot blood of youth, of love crossed long ago. And I took all the blame out of all sense and reason until I cried and trembled and rocked to and fro, riddled with light. Ah, when the ghost begins to quicken, confusion of the deathbed over, is it sent out naked on the roads, as the books say, and stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment. Now, other than being a masterclass in rhythm, rhyme, and poetic structure, Yeats says to us, a poem can be a place where I just ask an uncomfortable question. If we're so addicted to getting the answers, Yeats is basically saying, before any of this technology existed, who just felt the temptation to go to ChatGPT and ask, is there an afterlife? Are we stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment? Now, that may sound ridiculous, but again, I think that's what Leo is talking about, that very desire to not sit with that question. Who among us hasn't sat with the question, is there an afterlife? None of us will know the answer to that. But what if that question exists because it transforms us by holding it? It doesn't mean we have to do it all the time. Many of us, me included, will feel a little bit, in a good way, spiritually tired after our meeting today. Go play with your kid, take a walk, be unconscious, play the guitar, listen to whatever music, okay? So we're not always meant, we're not designed to always be in that state of holding this great mystery and moving, but we can't lose that. And I think we're starting to feel that that's what we lose. Isn't everything kind of like a muscle? If I never used my left arm, it would atrophy. I've said before that, well, I'll say now, I'll make the point that if we don't use our capacity for holding mystery, it atrophies. But you see, our culture, once again, seems to value only things that can be immediately marketable. Like if you have a thought today, and that thought is, when the confusion of the deathbed is over, are we cast out and stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment? Maybe you've internalized the idea that that thought is not going to make you any money, that that thought is not going to make you any fame, that that thought doesn't make sense. If you brought it up at brunch, it would be uncomfortable for people. All those things might be true. Doesn't mean you have to bring it up at brunch. But maybe if you internalize the censor that tells you not to think those things, that capacity to think those things atrophies. And then we drift. And then we feel separate from ourselves. Go ahead.
This is coming to me. I have been a school teacher, middle school, high school, and I guess I'm a writer. If if one says one is a writer, I'm also a person in 12-step recovery. So all of those threads, I've thought a lot lately about. We are storytellers. Humans are storytellers by some instinct, some need. And when you just talked about the tweeting, and what I just experienced existed because I posted about it. I said a thing about it. I told people this is what I just experienced. Even just carrying the iPhone, we were in Scotland and on the coast, and I had to document everything with my iPhone. So if I was desperate to document that. I think that the impulse, the instinct for storytelling is so important, right? It creates community. It creates a sense of understanding what I'm living through, what we're living through. But it also seems to be absolutely in contradiction to sitting in the voiceless mystery. Yeah. What I want is an answer. I mean, I've been just dying lately, literally in this terrifying liminal space of what do you want me to do next? Yeah. That is important. That is my purpose. And I want an answer, preferably with words. And I kind of want to post that. I'm telling everyone, I'm telling y'all, I am not comfortable with wordless mystery. Yeah. And I think it may be the human condition.
Yeah. No, neither am I by nature. I can't stop talking. And this is so important. And let's draw this distinction. Go back to those ancient cave paintings in Lascaux and elsewhere. Even before that, there are markings on shells made by probably Homo habilis, Homo erectus. There is something in human nature that wants to, as you say, whether it's tell a story, create an image, use language, that wants to, you use the phrase, make sense of our world, which is what storytelling does, or simply just recreate it. We can't make sense of that. There's the divine cause of that. That, I think, is natural, healthy, pure, human, inexplicable mystery. What we can ask ourselves, Gwen, is what's the difference between those moments and the moments when I am doing something that looks like that, but my needs, as we talked about before, have been hijacked, so I'm actually doing it to avoid myself, to avoid making sense of myself. So if I'm on a great vacation and I get the cell phone out and I say, let's take a picture, let's remember this moment, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people might never want to do that, that's okay. But if I'm looking through my phone to avoid the experience entirely because it's overwhelming, that's human, but maybe that's something we should be aware of. You see, so those are distinct. And then you get into the point about those moments where even the first one, we let go of at times. And that's very hard. I'm a writer. I mean, I used to sit, when I go to the monastery and on a silent retreat, or my hand is on fire to write something down that came into my mind. Oh, I'm going to forget it. And I don't know the answer to that, right? And there are times when I will just say relinquishing that has helped me, but that is a labor. So comes back to what I said at the beginning of the class. What you just did, I think, is the good work. You are talking about what you need. You are talking about being aware of that. And in sitting with that, no one knows the answer. But you did that step. You did that step of sitting with saying, I need this. I'm really, calling out for this. Silence is very, very difficult. As you say, by nature, we are meaning makers and we are image makers. I will say that I mentioned Thomas Keating, and he and others developed something that has come to be known as centering prayer. It's a meditative tradition. When I do it, I feel rare moments of joy. There's a listening to the world and just being in that listening. So I just want to honor what you're saying, Gwen, and the wrong thing for me to do, which I think a lot of kind of, I hate to say it this way because I use these tools too, but like Instagram gurus would try to convince you to like, let it all go and forget about the answer entirely. What I'm saying is embrace the part of your humanity that needs that, see where that's trying to take you, while at the same time challenging yourself to go into the science. Does that make a little bit of sense, Gwen? That's the way I've thought about it often.
Can I piggyback Gwen?
Yeah, real quick, because Grace has a hand, but
Oh,
go ahead.
okay. I can remember what it is.
Okay, good. Okay, Grace, go ahead.
You can go. You go, Lauren, because mine switches gears.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Grace. Yeah, Gwen, I want to share a song that was shared with me a week ago or so. I love your share, and I was thinking about the word, like what you were saying, and the word invitation kept coming to my mind of like being with these discomforts and then to express it like you did and have the awareness, as Joseph is pointing out. I think that's powerful. And then we are invited, whether that's through poetry, whether that's through any written word, whether it's through just naming, this is the fear that I have. That's so powerful. And then it gives permission to everybody else in the room who's listening to be like, okay, Gwen, like I feel the way that Gwen feels. Like, and I feel safe to say something about it. And then therefore I'm exercising this muscle. But let me just share this song is so short. And then Grace, thank you. About a year ago, I started singing in community. We all have a beautiful voice. And this one was shared to me by a friend named Yin. She lives in Bellingham, Washington. We're in the Pacific Northwest. And I love this because it encapsulates, I feel like, what Gwen was saying and kind of this whole conversation. And you can sing the song and it's like a prayer. It's like a mantra. It's short. It's a circle song. It's intended to, like, you can sing it to your kids, you know, it's great. So it goes, I do not fear the unknown. The unknown becomes known as I know myself. I want to know myself. I'll repeat it one time. I do not fear the unknown. The unknown becomes known as I know myself. I want to know myself. And I think, so Gwen, when you were talking, I'm like, I've been singing this song a lot since this friend taught it to me truly like a week ago, or I teach it to clients who are, a lot of them who are grieving or have severe histories of trauma. And sometimes I just like put a hand to my heart and I can sing this song as like a balm of like, oh my God, I don't have the answers. Or like today it feels really dysregulated, but also I can sing like, this isn't a lie. Like, I don't have to fear this. I can be with it. And all, you know, and in being with it, I am becoming, I am knowing myself. Okay, that's all. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Lauren. That's so beautiful. And I just love that you kind of brought song. It always opens up the human spirit just to hear like what our voice can do. And just before I go to Grace, I'll say it's so important, this question of fear. And again, remember really what I'm talking about today. Jesus as one kind of teacher, just no matter what one thinks of his divinity. Can you imagine that level of human wisdom about the human spirit? I mean, it's incredible. And when he says, don't be afraid, you don't tell someone to calm down unless they're anxious. So he's saying there is a fear there. But my way of thinking about it, I often say to myself and to my students, what would happen if just one time you felt behind all the fears, the great fear? What if that's the healing move? So in other words, what are you afraid of, right? You might say, like, for example, I'm someone who suffers from mental illness. And sometimes my mental illness will take me in a direction of a deeply irrational fear. And the only way I ever get out of it is saying, what's the fear behind the fear? I've got to climb down. Otherwise, it's going to hurt more. And you see, those are the moments when you heal, because when you realize the defense mechanism is causing more pain than what it defends you from, it can go away. So I might be afraid of something irrational. And then I say, my God, I'm really terrified to die. My God, I am really terrified I will be forgotten forever. No one likes to say these things to themselves or out loud. My God, I'm really afraid for the safety of my son. If I get, if there are a lot of eyes on me or something like that, my God, I don't think I'm worthy. Who likes to say those things? But if we can connect, Lana says, me too, thank you. If we can connect to those moments of like, ask yourself that question. So that the overarching theme of what I'm saying is, whether you take the teachings of Jesus or you take the teachings of any teacher or anybody at all, never go for the cheap, repress this part of yourself, right? It's look at, face, embrace it. Doesn't mean you have to do it 24/7. Doesn't mean it has to be spiritually exhausting. We need a break. We need to eat the ice cream. Yesterday I spent all day, my son had a question about the solar system. So we went to Hobby Lobby. We got our little tour, and we spent the whole day building a solar system. And it was the best day I've had in a long time. I wasn't sitting with the deep questions of life, but I was doing what Rilke said. I was living them, so that's important, I think. Sorry, Grace, I kept you waiting long enough.
Yeah, I'm so glad that part of the conversation happened. So thanks for singing too, Lauren. That's cool. I just wanted to say I love your AI poem so much, and
thanks.
It was fresh again today. But one of the things I love so much is how you connect the dots between the big work of being human and living life to the full and being able to love and be creative and all of that with the small work. And I think that is what I'm loving about the Pope's letter and just about this conversation about AI is there's this kind of narrative that AI will take care of the little things so that we're free to focus on the big things. But like you can't, the small things are where you are building the capacity to understand and think about. And so like, and this idea of Christ, like the life he lived was a product of what he did and his practice. And so, I really appreciate you connecting, even if it's just one little paper, one little thing, that small work is what is, making us. And I think one of my favorite definitions of virtue is that it's being response able. So like we respond out of all the little pieces that have built that capacity within us. So don't skip those things. Yeah. So
it's just so beautifully said, Grace. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Oh, thank you.
And it's true when you talk about the little things. And we're all intelligent enough to make distinctions. When are the things, a vacuum makes it easier for our lives, whatever. But don't let the world sell you your death under the guise of convenience. This will make your life easier until there's no life to have, right? So ease is one thing. We should have that. As I sit here today, I'm someone, I hate the heat. It just makes my mind just go in a million directions. So people see me in summer and I've got like a scarf on and I've got the AC going and I'm benefiting from this. I'm paying for it, but I'm benefiting from this technology. So we make choices. But you're absolutely right. It's like being mindful about the times when am I letting the powers that be sell me something that looks like convenience as a way of, I hate to use this term, but I'll use it, lobotomizing my soul, and then I'm just not there. What do you want to do? Lie back on your deathbed and say that was easy? I mean, it's a privilege. Look, it's a privilege to be able to talk about that. I'm not talking about the fact that there's someone right now in a really, really difficult situation who doesn't even have drinking water. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about technologies that allow people to live. We're talking to each other on a computer. But with grace, you are talking about those moments of personal soul formation. Absolutely. Alicia, please. Did you have a hand, Alicia?
I think it says Christine.
Oh, Christine, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, Alicia, you're muted. Are you talking? Oh,
She looks like she's talking.
she's talking. Alicia, are you? Well, we're going to circle back to you. We'll try to get that technology worked out. Oh, there you are. There you are.
Yeah, I didn't realize that I didn't unmute myself. Talking about how, I don't know, I guess at some degree overwhelmed by the number of topics that we generated with this conversation. I mean, the brokenness, telling the story. Maya, I thought when we were talking about Satan, I mean, I like the Hindu version of it that is there with us from the beginning. And that's the Satan of the Christian tradition, telling the story, facing the shadow. And I'm like, okay, it's too many things to deal right now, one at a time. And the great fear, which, as I get older and see people a little older than me, but close to me, that they are disappearing and lost a sister, lost a brother. Those fears are very real. And, you try to talk to them. Okay, I'm afraid about this. And, have to face it. Yeah. I don't have a solution about it. I think the only thing is really to know yourself to the point that you can say, which that will be my goal, to be able to say, okay, all right, I can go in peace. It's okay. I've done whatever I was able to do, and it's okay.
That's very beautiful, Alicia. I feel that as you say it, and I feel your energy as you say it. And this question too, remember, this all circles back to living in complexity. So when we talk about the great fear, remember what I said. Like, I promise you, I'm not, after this session, Alicia just said, we brought up so much, I am going to stare at a wall. I can't live in this space 100% of the time. You know what it makes me think of for some reason? If you've ever been to Rome and seen in person the Colosseum, why was the Colosseum built? The Colosseum was built as a place of death. It was a sport. The closest I've ever gotten was seeing a bullfight in Madrid, which I immediately regretted. Didn't want to have been there. But anyway, but it was also built to try to conquer death, to put it into a form. And the Romans would have been there and said, there's death out there in the world. Maybe we can put it in this little place. It's a poem. It's putting it in this place. And I think there are times in our lives when we can look at those great fears, and other times when we simply must be. And so a very different culture that the Romans lived in, it was like they weren't facing the big existential ideas of death. It was a game, it was a sport, unfortunately, in which people sort of die. But the point is that Alicia brings up a real truth here, and let's sit with Alicia's truth, which is that this can be really overwhelming. So I'm packing a lot in here, but honor the fact that if you're you need to know when to make yourself uncomfortable, right? Like, learning isn't easy, growth isn't easy. Remember when you were a kid and you were going through those growth spurts and oh, my knee, I can't, it's like everything hurts. Honor the moments when becoming also looks like unconsciousness, rest, whatever if you're the kind of person who has a cocktail on the beach. I mean, that's humanity, So I think it's very important to really take what Alicia is saying, to heart, and to notice that and to honor that, right? So it's really, really, and you make a very beautiful point, Alicia, about, I hope we all can feel that at the end. I did everything I could, and that's it. Christine had a hand, I think.
Yes, yes. Um, I'm thinking about, you just touched on it, but how the natural world is an antidote to the downside of technology.
Hmm.
And I wrote a little poem, very short, it's like a sentence in length, last Wednesday. And I renamed it 4 times this morning. So now it's called Nature. Outside of my mind, beyond my skin, there's a whole existence brimming with aliveness, thrilled to get my attention.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's really beautiful. You're absolutely right. Nature. You know, I wrote a poem once called Instructions for Having a Soul. I started out, it was kind of playful, and then, you know, I realized I was really telling myself things I needed to hear. And it begins with the line, take it out into the rain sometimes, you know. And you know, we don't want, I mean, nature, it's easy to sentimentalize it, which I don't think you're doing, Christine, but it's easy to sentimentalize it when we're sitting in air conditioning. Nature's a pretty brutal thing. James Dickey used to write about that. I think he has a line called The Heaven of Animals, imagining where animals go after, you know, if they had a heaven, every fantasy that a child has. And he begins the poem, I think, with the line, it would not be the place it is without blood. In other words, that's their heaven too. So yes, connecting to nature in a way where we feel like we're connecting to a process of becoming.
Joseph, I have to tell you,
Yeah.
that poem, which I saw on your Instagram, is the reason I came today.
Oh, that really warms my heart, Christine. You know, I bloviate about all these theological and philosophical things, but when you really get me in a corner, my fundamental belief is poetry is the way to say it, because poetry at its best, an ideal that I've never reached, but I will always strive for, poetry speaks with the mind, the body, the soul, all at the same time. You know, through its rhythms and its images, it bypasses our conscious mind, it engages it. So anytime somebody tells me, and thank you so much for saying that, that something I've written has had that effect, is very, very, very powerful for me. So thank you. Well, we've reached 90 minutes. I don't know how all the time went by. I wish I could sit with you all, you know, in real life, as that phrase is, and just keep talking about these things. I just hope that. Oh, Carol Ann has a thought. Yes. Oh, you're muted. Wait, we can't hear you, Carol Ann. Maybe I can unmute. No, you're still muted. It's not letting me unmute you, Carol Ann. You'll have to unmute from your side. Are you able to do that?
Oh, there we go.
There you are.
I was clicking on the unmute or the thing on my face, but down below is where I should do it. So I'm sorry I'm late. Something came up that I had to attend to. So I'm a songwriter, which is a poet that, you know, puts it to music. And I'd like to offer a short song, a poem that I wrote when my whole life shattered about 3 years ago. And really, the details don't matter. Most of us, if we're alive, we know what it feels like to have our life just shattered. And so I was walking on the beach. My home was on Maui, Hawaii, and this song just came to me. Calling all angels to walk beside me. Calling all angels to love and guide me. Calling all angels to hold me in your grace. Calling all angels to always keep me safe.
Oh, that's so beautiful, Carol Ann. Thank you.
And
You know,
angels for me are the higher vibration energies
yeah.
that are not something really disembodied or other than. It's just a refined state of energy, and we can call that energy into us when the surface of life crumbles.
You know,
and that's a form of healing and energy.
it's beautiful. And let me just say this in closing, that we are at the threshold, there's no doubt about it, of the end of one way of making a civilization. What that means, nobody knows, but it also means that language is changing. And can you hear that, Carol Ann, you spoke about angels, and you sang this beautiful song, and then a part of you, a very human part of you, wanted to say, like, this is what angels means to me. In other words, if we had said the word angels even in 1849, we might not have had to clarify to a group of people what it means. And this is a very interesting thing, is we're at a threshold when our language, very language, is changing. But I think what we're all starting to realize is maybe I can't call it what I used to call it, but I still need it. Rilke, in his great Duino elegies, really written at a time of crisis, personal crisis, and also around the time of the First World War and the moment of high modernity, the great change in history, begins with the line, "Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the hierarchies of angels?" And that is and Rilke is crying out what would happen, in a way, if we lost our contact with something bigger. And it turns out what we're discovering, every single one of us, whether your God is money, whether your God is Christ, whether your God is whatever the case may be, we just need that. We're built for that. And I want to also say, because song has come up twice, I want to share a quick personal anecdote, that when I was a young boy, and I would go to church just because it was the thing that my mother said I had to do, and dress up, wear my little Sunday best. Even at the times when I was wrestling with this figure, bloody figure on a cross, and not understanding what it meant for me, and feeling the repression of one version of Christianity, there was a woman, and her name was Sister Peggy. And Sister Peggy was a nun in middle age, and she had the voice of an angel, and she didn't look the part, just very regular looking, and she would wander up to the pulpit and sing. And the ministry of song, the ministry of poetry, connecting to people through these art forms that do bypass our conscious mind and immediately go to us. And so I think it's great that Carol Ann and Lauren have honored that. Christine, you spoke about poetry. I know many of you here are writers as well. So, we don't have to always express it in those ways, but I do think if there is that God that we imagine, what did that God do but create for absolutely no reason we can understand? And if there is something in us that is driven to create, like those ancient cave painters, that is what it is to be, is such a huge part of what it is to be human. Let's honor that. Let's live with the questions. Let's embrace the parts of ourselves that are meant to be complex and unresolvable, while at the same time, surviving. So I want to thank all of you. This has been a deeply enriching chat for me. It's great to see, as I say, familiar faces, to put faces to some names that I've encountered in the cyberspace of ours. I'm going to try to get the recording ready to go, and just give me a little time with that. You can always email me or my assistant Emma, and we can get that to you anytime. I always close by saying, anytime anybody has something you want to discuss further, you can email me. I always take suggestions for classes and gatherings. But other than that, I'll be on a little bit of a break for about a week, and then I'll be back doing my normal yapping online. All right, everybody. Okay, much love to you all. God bless.
Enjoyed staring at the wall.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lauren.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.